Hey everyone, welcome back to True Crime Cafe. Last week I took you through the unsolved case of Jackie English. When I was doing my research for that video, I was sent down an endless rabbit hole of unsolved homicides in London and the surrounding area, dating back from 1956 up until 1983. Some believe that some of these cases might be connected.
At the time these crimes initially occurred, they didn't really know what they were dealing with. But in retrospect, we now have identified and arrested 3. And then in addition to that, the remaining 19 are the work of, we know, at least 3, possibly 6 other serial offenders.
When I got through the information on the Jackie English case, I was really on the fence of whether or not I believed she was killed by the dubbed Forest City Killer or killers, or if she was killed by somebody she knew. So I decided to go back through all of the unsolved homicides between this 27-year period. Today I'm taking you back to 1956 to the oldest unsolved homicide in London. This is the case of Susan Cadieux. I have a really hard time getting through cases like Susan's because this is a young child we're talking about. I think cases like this hit me a little bit differently, perhaps because I have kids myself, but I think anybody who isn't a psychopath, this kind of stuff just hits you a little bit different. So be prepared as we get through the information on this case. Susan Cadieux of London, Ontario was 5 years old in 1956. She actually had only just turned 5 on December 21st of 1955, which was only a few weeks prior to her murder. She was born to her mother, Gabrielle Cadieux, and father, Walter Cadieux. She also had 2 older brothers, Edmund Cadieux and Patrick Cadieux. According to an article from the Ottawa Citizen from 1956, they actually went by Mike and Pat. So that's how I'm going to refer to them throughout this video. At the time, Mike was just shy of 10 years old, and his younger brother Pat was a week and a half away from his 9th birthday. The evening of Friday, January 6, 1956, would change this family's life forever. Pat, Mike, Susan, and another neighborhood girl, Virginia Gerlach, were out playing in the neighborhood. They headed to St. Mary's Church to the schoolyard. This is at 345 Lyle Street. At 7:15 p.m., they were playing in the area of the playground in the schoolyard. At approximately 7:45, a man approached the children and started speaking to them, but he was particularly focused on speaking to Susan. I guess as he was making casual conversation with the kids, he mentioned that he lived over on York Street, but as he was saying this, he was actually pointing towards King Street, which is in the total opposite direction of York. He also told the children that he was there because he was meeting the priest at St. Mary's Church. At some point, Pat and Mike get distracted when Virginia falls on some ice nearby. So I guess they go over to help her. And this is when the man takes the opportunity to walk away with Susan. I guess as he's walking away with Susan, she relays back to the other kids that the man has something for her. So he used some kind of promise to Susan in order to lure her away. At around 8 p.m., the boys arrive home to report to their parents what happened to Susan. The boys were able to provide enough information that a composite sketch was able to be developed. The man is described as white, tall, and thin. He was between the ages of 30 to 40, and he was clean shaven. He was wearing a light brown overcoat. He also had unbuckled black boots. He was wearing what the children described as a Russian style hat, but the London police have described it as possibly being an army militant with ear flaps. We have 3 key pieces of information along with a composite sketch for any witnesses that might be out there. We have St. Mary's Schoolyard at 345 Lyle Street. We have January 6, 1956, around 7:15 to 8 p.m. Susan's parents began their search immediately for their daughter, and London police got involved around 9:30 p.m. that night. I think the only heartwarming part of this story is that by 1:30 a.m., there were over 300 people searching for Susan. It wasn't until the next morning at 10:08 a.m. on Saturday, January 7th, that Susan Cadieux's body was found. She was found at 609 William Street near the rear of what was then Roy James Construction. She was along the CPR spur line, the railroad tracks, and she was on her back with one arm across the railway. She was found fully clothed. The autopsy was performed by pathologist Dr. Fred Looney at St. Joseph's Hospital. For some reason that is unknown to me, Susan's body was sent to a pathologist at Victoria Hospital to cross-check the findings of the initial pathologist. This was reported to actually be the first independent examination done in London police records. The autopsy did show that Susan was sexually assaulted, and it showed that her death was due to exposure. It had been minus 14 degrees on the night of her disappearance. So essentially, Susan froze to death on these railroad tracks. This is an absolutely horrific death for anyone, but it is extremely upsetting that this was a child. I think the most disturbing piece of information I learned about this case was from an article published by the Ottawa Citizen in the few days after Susan's death. This article reported that Susan had actually been found with tears frozen to her cheeks. Police made a statement to media at the time that Susan had been dropped there in the dark of pre-dawn hours. I find this statement significant because they said that she had been dropped there. To me, this indicates that Susan didn't get away from the man who had taken her and ran there herself. It tells me that this man brought Susan there. The police made a statement to media that Susan had been dropped there in the dark of pre-dawn hours. I find this statement significant because this indicates to me that Susan didn't get away from her kidnapper and run there herself. This indicates to me that the man carried Susan there, dropped her there, and left her to die in the cold. I also think it's significant that they said that she was dropped in the pre-dawn hours because this was on a night where 300 people were searching for Susan. Now, the location of where Susan was kidnapped from and the location of where her body was found is not a significant distance. So it makes me believe that someone had to have seen something. This shows the 2 location points between where the kidnapping occurred and where Susan's body was found. We don't know if this man had a car since Mike, Pat, and the other neighborhood girl reported that the man had walked up to them while they were playing. So if this man was on foot with Susan, this is a 19-minute walk from the location of the kidnapping. If he was driving, it's about a 4-minute distance. Susan wasn't placed by the rail tracks until sometime before dawn, so the kidnapper had to have gone somewhere with Susan. Does this indicate that the man did live in the area or that he did have access to a vehicle nearby? Either way, the man walked or drove somewhere with Susan on January 6, 1956, approximately between the hours of 7:45 and 8 p.m. They went somewhere, either on foot or by car. Someone had to have seen something. A piece of information that's missing to the public at this time is whether or not footprints were found in the snow leading to and from where Susan's body was found. The police have given no indication that they know which direction the man and Susan came from and what direction the man left in. Friends, family, and community came together to say goodbye to Susan on Monday, January 9th of 1956. 3 priests sang a Mass of the Angels in St. Mary's Church. She was laid to rest in St. Peter's Cemetery in London, Ontario. I don't think this case is unsolved because of lack of effort on the London police. I mean, on the night of her disappearance, there were over 300 people that had gathered to search for Susan in the hours after her disappearance. And following the discovery of her body, police began an intensive manhunt for the person who did this to Susan. The community had actually pledged a reward in the capture of Susan's abductor, and police had 22 detectives working around the clock to try and crack the case. Police also sent plainclothes detectives to Susan's funeral and her burial in the off chance that the perpetrator would attend. This is not an uncommon thing to happen, where a perpetrator kind of inserts themselves by going to the funeral or being involved in the search of a missing person, or even inserting themselves into the investigation with police. And at the time, actually, London police even reported to the media that this wasn't unusual behavior in cases like this. Something to possibly consider is if there's people out there who were a part of the search for Susan or attended the funeral, if they could think back to anything that seemed out of the ordinary, it would be really important to bring that forward to the police. There is nothing that is too small, no piece of information that is too insignificant. It is up to the police to determine the value of a piece of information. There weren't really any significant developments reported in this case until 2000. Sometime in 2000, the Fifth Estate released a documentary on the case of Lynn Harper and the wrongful conviction of Stephen Truscott. In this documentary, they highlight what they believe is an overlooked suspect in the case of Lynn Harper. It was after the release of this documentary that CBC TV stated that police at this time in 2000 were considering this same suspect in the case of Susan Cadieux. This suspect is Alexander Kalchuk. He worked at a military base in Clinton, close to where Lynn Harper was murdered, and he also at one point lived in Aylmer, Ontario, which isn't too far from London. And he has a long history of sexual offenses against young girls.
Kalchuk was a troubled man, a heavy drinker with a history of sexual offenses. He lived in this farmhouse with his wife and 3 children, less than a 20-minute drive from the Clinton base. He worked as a supply technician there until 1957. He transferred to another base in Aylmer, about an hour's drive away. But he made frequent trips back to Clinton, where Lynn Harper's father was the senior supply officer. Kalachuk's record of sex offenses went back at least a decade. In 1950, he had 2 convictions for indecent exposure in Trenton. He stopped 3 young farm girls on a country road outside St. Thomas, Ontario. He tried to lure one of them, a 10-year-old, into his car, offering a gift of new underwear. He left when he saw the girl's father approaching, but was later arrested by the OPP and charged. A week later, a judge dismissed the charge for lack of evidence. Air Force medical officers were discussing his weakness for alcohol and little girls. They met with a probation officer who was reporting another incident of indecent exposure involving Kalachuk, this time in Seaforth, a few miles from the Clinton base. And back at the Aylmer base where he worked most of the time, a medical doctor opened a file on Sergeant Alexander Kalachuk. On July 2nd, 3 weeks after Lynn Harper was murdered, Kalachuk is said to be suffering from overwhelming anxiety, tension, depression, and guilt. The senior medical officer was blunt in his diagnosis. His problem was sexual deviation and anxiety reaction. Kalachuk entered hospital July 22nd, still described as tense, nervous, and suffering from anxiety and depression, a strong overreaction if he was simply worried about a minor charge that had been dismissed almost 2 months earlier. Kalachuk was released, but apparently far from cured. A heavily censored confidential military memo about Sergeant Kalachuk's aberrations warned cryptically that when he was later posted at a base near Clinton, ongoing incidents were serious enough to get into the local paper. In fact, police were warning about the activities of an unidentified molester who was preying on young girls from a car. Through all of which, Sergeant Kalachuk managed to avoid particular attention as a suspect in those incidents. That would change when an Air Force flight lieutenant named Willard Bud Longley later stumbled across Kalachuk's psychiatric file at the Clinton base. Longley got permission to conduct an investigation which lasted for 3 months in the mid-60s, and it reinforced his darkest suspicions. He uncovered Kalachuk's history of sexual crimes.
Alexander Kalachuk died in 1975, so we're not getting any answers from him. And unfortunately, we're not getting any answers from London police either. In 1997, Project Angel was developed as a special task force to look into 20 unsolved homicides in southwestern Ontario. One of these was the case of Susan Cadieux. In February of 2000, the lead investigator of this task force came forward and revealed to media that they had identified 2 suspects in some of the 20 cases that they had been investigating through Project Angel. However, these suspects are dead. Now, due to the Information and Privacy Act, police are unable to publicly reveal the identities of these 2 suspects. The lead investigator didn't directly say that either of these suspects were in relation to the Susan Cadieux case, but I do think that that is kind of interesting information. However, it has been 46 years since the death of Alexander Kalachuk, and the case of Susan Cadieux is still open. So this makes me believe that perhaps the identities of suspects that were found in 2000 are not in relation to Susan Cadieux, and that perhaps London police are no longer considering Alexander Kalachuk as a suspect, perhaps. I'm really not too sure. I think it's very possible that there were people in the area who may have saw something and don't realize that it's significant. This was a Friday evening, so it makes me think there had to have been youth out in the neighborhood who are still around, who maybe saw somebody who fit the description of the composite sketch. No piece of information is too insignificant. No piece of information is too small to bring forward to police, because it could be the smallest piece of information that could bring a development in this case. It could even help even just piece together the timeline between 7:45 when Susan was taken and the 10:08 a.m. time when she was found the next day. It could really help put pieces together of what happened between those 2 time periods. Where did Susan go with the man who took her? If anyone has any tips in regards to the Susan Cadieux case, please contact London Police Force at 1-800-222-8477. Thank you so much for joining me on this week of True Crime Cafe and for listening along to the details of the case of Susan Cadieux. Please consider sharing this video to get the information out there to possibly help bring forward any eyewitnesses in this case. Make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so that you don't miss next week's episode of True Crime Cafe, where justice will be served.